You're listening to the Doc Lounge podcast. This is a place for candid conversations with healthcare industry's top physicians, executives, and thought leaders. This podcast is made possible by Pacific Companies, your trusted advisor in physician recruitment. I am your host, Summer Gilbert, and I am the Director of Marketing and Branding here at Pacific Companies. And today, my co-host is our EVP of Training here at Pacific Companies, Mr. Chris Kahl. Today on the podcast, we are honored to have back with us Dr. Michael Young Lee. Dr. Lee is a family medicine physician working out of Southern California. His last episode with us was on burnout, and then we had COVID, so what a perfect time for that episode to come out. This episode today, we talk to him about starting at an HMO setting at Kaiser Permanente and moving to a private group setting and what that was all about. And then we end the podcast talking about emotional resilience, which is so important today. And he quotes some wonderful things from Brené Brown, which we're all fans of here. So without further ado, let's start our episode with Dr. Michael Young Lee.
Thanks, Dr. Lee, for being here. First, for a medical student, let's say, trying to figure out what they want to do, if you could kind of give some characteristics of a good, family medicine, because a lot of the docs, they're in medical school, like, well, what's my calling? What insights could you give them to help them make a good selection?
Definitely. No, Chris, that's a great question. And that's probably like the $1 million question, just because I can't tell you how many med students, and it's so tough because they're asked to determine like the future of their next however many years of their career within just a year or two of trying out some different rotations that they do for a couple of weeks or a couple of months in medical school training. So, I'll tell you with primary care, I always think of it as it's very, people interaction oriented. So if you're an extrovert, if you're someone who likes to communicate, talk to people, get to know them on a deeper level, then primary care is actually a great option for you. If you're more of an introvert and, you don't really care as much about those interactions and you like to do more, other things, then maybe doing a more procedural based specialty or even something like radiology, something like that might be more, more for you. But, I think a lot of it actually, I'll tell you, has to do with self-awareness. You'd be surprised at how many people go into specialties, but don't even really understand what they like or what they don't like. And they just kind of go into something because they sort of have this sort of vision or idealistic sort of attitude or mentality that I'm going to save the world and, or that I want to do all these things. And then they go into their specialty and they're miserable because they just didn't take that extra time to really think about what are the things I enjoy? What are the things I don't enjoy? What are the things I'm looking for in the next 10 to 20 years of my career? And then making a call based on that. And so I think a lot of it's just kind of knowing who you are and what kind of things interest you before you really think about a specialty. And I always tell people, like, although you want to think about lifestyle and work, that I know those shouldn't always be the primary things, because you can have the lifestyle you wanted, but if you're miserable doing what you're doing, that might not be fun. Because I know I have some, it doesn't work. I have some colleagues who I think would have been great surgeons and they love surgery, but they just didn't go into it because they were so scared of the lifestyle. And now they're doing primary care, they're doing some other specialty and very unhappy when I think they would have been really happy going to some sort of surgical specialty, So I always tell people, like, oftentimes you can shape practices. And even though it might be a little bit more demanding in some ways, if you're doing something that you love or that you really enjoy, it's going to really make up for some of those things that you feel like you might be missing out. And not necessarily missing out on, but just kind of finding that balance that you can find in that way.
Does it take a long time to switch specialties if you are a doctor and you're in something?
It can. I'll tell you, it can, just because of residency training can be a couple of years. And then the other thing is some of these residencies are very competitive. So it may be challenging even getting into some of them. But I'll tell you, if you're in your first or second year of residency and you realize, oh my gosh, this is not for me. Like, primary care wasn't what I thought it was going to be, or, pathology or whatever it is. Then I would say do it and be bold and be courageous and try to make that change. Because I always tell people the earlier you can do that and the earlier you find that you're not happy what you're doing,
It's great
the
advice.
better it's going to be, because you're talking about investing in the next 30 years of your life, And so again, if it's something where you're going to have to put in an extra few years. So I've had friends who did one specialty, realized they were unhappy, and actually went back and did another residency in that other specialty and are just so much happier 5 to 10 years later down the line versus just being permanently miserable doing something that you don't really enjoy in that way.
Right. Now, out of training, I noticed, Dr. Lee, that you accepted a position with the National Health Service Corps.
Yes.
Why'd you select this position over others? I'm sure you had a lot of suitors after your skill set. Why was it here?
I really enjoyed working with the underserved at the time, and especially before I went into medical school, I did a lot of volunteering with the homeless population, with some of the underserved population, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. So I just knew that I wanted to do something with the underserved, and the National Health Service Corps was great because it paid for my medical school education and really just allowed me to commit and make a commitment to committing time with the underserved. Because I think if I didn't, it's very easy to get sucked into a job that you're just not that you're in it for the money, but that salary does play a big role. And sometimes you can kind of lose sight of your ideologies in that way of why you went into medicine. So that's why the National Service Corps was great for me, because it made me commit to wanting to serve that population for a couple of years. And I can't tell you the learning I got out of it was amazing, because it was crazy. You're working with a lot of patients who don't have health insurance, who don't have a lot of things. So you're the go-to for everything. And so it was probably the best learning curve out of residency for me to be able to work with that population. And then now going anywhere else after that, it is not as scary or stressful for me. Because if you can do that, I'll tell you, you can manage and handle a lot of other types of practices for sure.
Right. I noticed when we visited with you previously, you've done a lot of work in your previous job at Kaiser, which you're no longer at.
Right.
But you were doing work with residents and kind of bringing them along. How'd that come about? Did you always have that kind of interest to give back, like you just mentioned with the Service Corps?
Definitely. What I notice a lot of times with my colleagues is that there are so many things that you learn as you're practicing, and you're like, man, I wish someone had just told me this stuff back when I was a resident. And so, I think having those things, it really made me want to go back and share with the residents, all the things I learned. It was really fun. I do a personal finance talk with the residents. I wish someone would have given me a personal finance talk and told me about what the difference between a 401k is and a Roth and all these things that, and I go back and do a talk on wellness and, and how to set boundaries. And so I think, again, these are all things that I wish someone had done for me when I was a resident. So that's kind of part of why I enjoyed being part of the residency training, and, just being able to just be a mentor and being able to guide them was one of the most favorite things I really enjoyed while I was at Kaiser at that time.
So you felt vested there, but 3 years ago, you had a change. And you went to One Medical.
Yeah.
What was that change that One Medical attracted you from maybe the next step in your career?
I think I got to an age where I was just thinking, what else is out there? It would have been very easy for me to just stay and just but keep my practice there, keep my panel, and do that until I retired. But I think for me, a lot of it had to do with intellectual curiosity of just thinking, I kept hearing all these things from my friends who were outside of Kaiser, all these healthcare changes. And being at Kaiser, I have to admit, I was very sheltered from a lot of what was happening on the outside in terms of the healthcare landscape. And for someone like me who's interested in policy, who's interested in how things are going outside, I really wanted to just make a break, take a change. And I don't know if you want to call it midlife crisis. I haven't bought my motorcycle yet, but I'm just kidding. But definitely, I think it was something where I just felt like if I was going to do it, I had to do it now, because obviously the older you are and the more vested you are, and as a partner at Kaiser, the harder it is to leave. So I think for me, it just got to a point where I just had to be courageous, take a move. And thankfully I had the support of my family, which was huge, that I was able to do that. And so I was very grateful that I had that opportunity.
Great. Yeah. Now, I know you seem to have a great interest in this term, emotional resiliency. I think you're a resident expert on that. Could you go into your thought process on that for our listeners?
For sure. And actually, when I was at Kaiser and actually outside of Kaiser, I did a lot of coaching for burned out physicians. So, if there was a burned out colleague or physician, I would definitely reach out to them. And, and that was a nice thing about SCPMG, was that they really wanted to support, and especially here in Orange County, they really wanted to do what they could to support their physicians. And so it was a great opportunity for people to get to meet out there and meet with them, and just and what I noticed as a pattern was that, as a lot of physicians were we're very hard on ourselves. And so it really opened my window to a concept called self-compassion, which is huge to me. Because, if you think about it, how many times a day do you beat up on yourself? I suck. I'm so stupid. What was I thinking? I'm a horrible parent. I'm a horrible physician. I'm a horrible, you know what I mean? Like, think about how many times you do that. And it takes a toll on you. And, and I think it's very hard. And then how many of us as physicians, and I'm sure you may hear it in the physicians you talk to, suffer from imposter syndrome. Like, I'll be honest with you, I definitely suffered from it. I was an anthrop major in undergrad. If you wanted to talk about, any type of like other thing, writing essays and things like that, that was probably one of my things that I was good at. But when it came to doing organic chemistry or biochemistry, it was definitely not one of my strengths. So there are many moments I suffered from, like, am I smart enough to be here? Am I smart enough to be a doctor? And so I think having some of those things really affected my emotional sort of state of mind and my resiliency, especially the early years of my practice, where I think I was constantly berating myself for, making mistakes, not doing this, taking everything personally every time I got a bad patient satisfaction score. And I think those things can definitely take a toll on you over time.
Do you think that, that holding yourself accountable, if anything, is more difficult for, let's say, the younger doctors that grew up in social media and is always worried about how people like them? With the older doctor, maybe not necessary. Is there a difference between that older and younger doc with what you just discussed?
That's a great question, Chris. And I'll tell you, it's hard to know, but I would definitely say that I think social media has made us even more sensitive regarding a lot of the comments that we get. If you think about Yelp reviews, like if you think about, Facebook and Instagram and all these things, it definitely is harder, I think, for this younger generation, because there's so many places where they can get criticized or commented on or whatnot. So I think we're much more self-conscious in that sense too, as well. But I'll tell you, I think overall it's really hard. One of the things that when it comes to the emotional resiliency was just learning how not to take things so personally. I think I used to be that if someone, a specialist talk to me differently, or I felt like they were being discouraging or very like condescending, I would take that very personally. And so I think one of the things that I had to learn over time was learning not to take things so personally and really challenging the stories that my mind would make up. So, if you know Brene Brown, she's an amazing woman who's done a ton of TED Talks and written a bunch of books. And one of the things, if you ever get a chance, her book Rising Strong is really, really powerful. And she talks about sort of emotional triggers, and then just again, she calls it a 3-step process of emotional triggers is when you're triggered. Somewhere, like, give me, like, if you think about an example where you get emotionally triggered by something that someone close to you does, or a coworker, someone that walks right by in front of you and doesn't say hi to you. You know what I mean? It's like anything like that can be a trigger. And then once you're triggered, then to know how to she calls it rumbling is a second stage, where rumbling is kind of like challenging the story that your mind makes up. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, Chris, I see you, we're good friends, and you literally just walk right by me and don't say hi to me. Within milliseconds, my amygdala, this is the emotional intelligence part, sets off a fight or flight trigger, which then my brain will make up a story to justify why my amygdala got triggered. So my brain within milliseconds will say, oh, Chris is mad at me because I didn't invite him out last night with the guys, or something like that. And again, it may have nothing to do with any of that, but my brain is so fast in making up a story that then, of course, as we know, it turns into a big spiral, and that can get ugly. So then the rumbling piece of it would be for me to take a step back and say, okay, take a deep breath. I'm triggered. My mind is making up the story that he's mad at me because of this. What else could actually be happening? Giving Chris the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he just didn't see me. Maybe he had to rush off to go do something and wasn't paying attention, things like that. And then the third stage is the revolution, which is, now that I have that data, what am I going to do with that? And I think one of the things that often happens to us in medicine, and why we absorb so much of this emotion, but most of us were trained to suppress and keep moving. So how many of us were taught, keep your head down and just keep going? And I can't tell you how many of my colleagues literally were like, they would have literally like fevers, sickly, deathly ill, and still show up to work, or there was none of this sort of like aspect of self-care, self-compassion. And so again, it's one of those things that and then of course what happens is when we're that way, we turf that down to the people we're managing. So as leaders, we have to be really, in regards to knowing our emotional intelligence, we really have to work on this process, because as a leader, think about how many times you get triggered. Someone makes a comment about the decision you made or criticizes you for this. Learning how to be able to digest that and not react in a negative way is so important. And I think it's again, this woman, Susan David, wrote a great book called Emotional Agility. And she says, emotions are data, not directives. So again, don't let your emotions be the ones leading you to make actions. And how many of us let our emotions drive us, especially right now, considering COVID and how stressful things have been?
Yeah. Emotions aren't facts. That's what I've been told.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in your story that you make up, that first story, you have to think about how much of that is fact and how much of that is assumptions, unconscious biases, and past traumas that are affecting the story that you're making up. So Summer, if you're a physician and a specialist talks to you, talks to you with a little bit of a harsh tone, and you think, if you're already suffering from imposter syndrome or have it, think about the story your mind's going to make up. That specialist thinks you're an idiot. That specialist thinks that you don't know what you're doing, and none of those things might be true, but that's the story that your mind is making up. And so how much of that do we carry on it?
So do you think positive reinforcement makes people work harder? And like, as a boss, or like Chris, as one of the bosses of Pacific companies, positive reinforcement and pushing that positivity and to build that resilience, do you think that's a better way to work it?
I think so. I think it definitely can be, but at the same time, holding accountability, because there is something called toxic positivity. And I think we've all met people like that, where it's kind of annoying, they try to spin every bad thing and make it a good thing. And you're like, no, there's no good to that, but it is what it is, So I think we have to be careful not to also carry over into that toxic positive type of way too, because then that gets really fake and inauthentic and insincere. But I do believe that we have to be careful as leaders, that when we're leading, we're not attacking the individual and judging them, but we're focusing on the behavior. So again, that goes back to the emotional intelligence work, is again, not judging the person as like they're lazy, they're not a team player, they're not this, but really looking at like, it's just this behavior that they're doing is causing this effect, if that makes sense. And
how do we correct it? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And go from there. But how many of us unfortunately make judgments about our colleagues all the time? Like, oh, they're just lazy, or they're just not good at that. You know what I mean? And we have to be careful not to do those things, especially as we move up in the leadership aspect of it.
So Dr. Lee, I wanted to switch gears a little bit. Something I've always shared with candidates over the years, and for physicians that want to be in a big city, and you're in a big city, the Southern California Metro, you went from a protected, let's say, HMO with all the referrals within network, and now you went to a independent group, or group of some sort, where you have to go out and kind of shake the bushes to get patients. And where you're going to, let's say in the South Coast Plaza area, there seems to be plenty of doctors. So how are you going to go about to build your patient panel, given that you're probably in an area that has plenty of docs, and UCI probably has a couple family medicine docs coming out each year, staying in the area. Our population isn't growing too much. What are you going to do to build that practice?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you some of the things that I've learned from my colleagues as well who have done it too, is that a lot of it is honestly word of mouth. And right now, social media is a big way that people will get their names out there. And whether they want to subspecialize in something like nutrition or, wellness or whatever that looks like. But I'll tell you, one of the biggest things that I find, for me at least, that has helped me is word of mouth. You actually provide good care, you connect with people well, and you'd be surprised. They will tell everybody. You know what I mean? It's really funny. I've had patients that are like, oh my gosh, I've connected with you so well. I'm going to tell my family about you. I'm going to tell my friends. And I can't tell you, like, over time, how much of my panel has built up just from word of mouth more than anything else. Because I think right now, especially, you'd be surprised, because of our primary care shortage, people are really challenged with even trying to get in to see their primary care provider within a decent amount of time. I mean, a lot of practices are even backed up. You can't even get in to see your primary care provider for like a month or two in some places. So access is definitely one of the nice things that we offer at our practice is, we can get patients in soon from their appointment time. And that definitely makes a big difference in terms of attracting more patients.
I have a quick question. Have you noticed a rise in telehealth since COVID?
For sure. Yes, definitely. And I think actually a lot of physicians are looking for more telehealth type positions because, obviously it allows more flexibility. They can work from home. And so telehealth, I could see, is becoming much, much more popular among physicians, especially the younger ones who lifestyle is very important to them. And they want to not, they don't want to feel tied down by by their jobs, and they want to have that flexibility. That definitely is a way for a lot of them that they're looking for sure.
Do you think there's a negative to that though?
I do. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of times I feel like it's very hard to develop a connection with the patient just virtually. Like, you can do it to a point, but I find that there's so much lost and I'm sure you've maybe felt this if you've ever had a telehealth visit versus an in-person visit, at least from my perspective, I'm not really able to read them as well. I can't see a lot of body language. There's that energy that you get when you're seeing someone physically versus and actually examining them versus just seeing them. I'll be like, oh, can you push here? You know what I mean? But like, that's not the same as you do an exam on them. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there is some loss. And I do believe that telehealth should supplement in-person and office visits. I just don't think virtual visits is going to be the only way to go. I just don't find that that's going to be the way to at least provide the best and efficient and effective care for patients in the long run. I think we need to have telehealth visits because I think it's an adjunct and with the in-office visits, but I definitely think you need the two together and not just completely rely on virtual visits, especially with the connection piece.
Yeah, definitely. And Chris and I talk about this all the time because I do work from home part-time. And when I'm at work, I feel like there's such a different connection, He can walk right into my office, look straight into my eyes. We can get so much more done. And I can see that same working with telehealth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you with meetings, especially summer for me, when I go into meetings, I miss, a lot of the work doesn't happen at the meeting. A lot of the work happens after the meeting or at the break when people are having side conversations, face to face. And so I'm there with you. I really feel like the whole Zoom concept is great, but I just worry about the future because I feel like it's definitely taking some of the humanity piece out of our work, if that makes sense. So again, don't get me wrong. I think virtual telehealth medicine is important. I just don't want it to be the primary source of where people are getting their healthcare, especially primary healthcare.
And Dr. Lee, we see the same thing in recruiting. A lot of times in the past, we would actually physically meet the candidate because we wanted to make sure it was the right fit. It's trying to marry somebody just with a phone call, or maybe now, well, let's just do a Zoom. It's different when you're in the presence of somebody. And so even in our industry, it takes away some of our ability to appropriately advise the candidate and the client to say, this is a good fit because we're missing some important information.
Totally. No, Chris, I appreciate you sharing that. I also personally think that it takes away from the physician in these interactions because I can tell you a lot of my joy comes when I have the patient in front of me and we're talking face to face. I don't know, I could be wrong in thinking this, but I think burnout's going to be worse if everyone just did only virtual visits, in some sense, because then it just becomes more like an interaction more than it is like a connection, if that makes sense. And so, how much of our visit is the patient sharing something with me and me being able to like just touch them on the shoulder and be like, oh my gosh, that must be really hard. Or, have to just give them a cancer diagnosis and be able to give them tissue and give them a hug or something. Like, you can't do that. A lot of that physical connection piece is going to be lacking when you do these virtual visits. And then when you start looking at every patient as just a transactional visit, then it just becomes a job. It doesn't become a calling. The whole concept of that, to me at least, I feel like gets taken away in that sense.
All right. Well, Dr. Lee, for me, this was a great visit with you. I learned some things on your emotional resiliency. So I was very excited to be here today.
Oh, thank you so much. And I can't tell you, it's such a privilege for me to get asked to do these things. It's one of those things I love to share. And Definitely. I think and one of the pieces that I feel like sometimes we're lacking is a lot of times is that mentoring piece of like having more experienced physicians really mentoring and looking out for the younger ones. The challenge I think nowadays is healthcare has gotten to the point where I think a lot of the more experienced physicians are drowning, that they don't even have time to mentor a lot of times the younger physicians. So we really have to hopefully create avenues like this somewhere where you have podcasts like this, where you have these places where, younger physicians can actually just listen and hear stories, because I find that stories are sometimes the best things to do, and also reminding that they're not alone. Because I think a lot of times, I remember when I was a younger physician, I was like, am I the only one that sucks? Like, am I the only one that feels like they suck, or like that am I the only one with imposter syndrome, or that am I the only one that's burned out? And it was always nice to be able to talk to an older experienced colleague to be like, nah, man, I went through the same thing, or I'm going through it right now. And it really helped to have that connection with some of the older, like more experienced physicians for me.
And that's why we love having the Stock Lounge podcast, because 90% of our listeners are physicians, or students, med students, fellows, residents, and they learn a lot, whether it be a doctor telling a case. We have another series called Ask the Expert, where they're an expert in something and they, give their knowledge. So, we talk to hospital administrators and hear their side of the story. So I think this is good what we're doing, and I appreciate your kind words.
Yeah, no, thank you again. And this is great. And thank you again for inviting me. This is such an honor to be here.
Of course. Of course. Thank you to all our listeners. If you'd like to be notified when new episodes air, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And a big thank you to Pacific Companies. Without you guys, this podcast could not be possible. If you would like to be a guest, go to www.pacificcompanies.com. Thank you.